The handcuffs snapped shut around Lieutenant Emily Hayes's wrists. A sound so sharp, so cold, it cut the breath out of the entire room. It wasn't just the sound of metal, it was the sound of a sentence, of a warning. That's what happens when a woman thinks she can play soldier, someone murmured in the back. The journalist's flashes crackled, harsh as gunfire. The white light glinted off the scuffed polish of the floor, off Emily's immaculate uniform, the decorations they had allowed her to wear out of respect for procedure. She stood straight, chin raised, despite the pain of the cuffs biting her skin. At that precise moment, she was no longer the decorated sniper, the one they called Angel in the field. She was nothing more than an isolated figure, an example put on display to remind everyone that the army had its limits, and that a woman did not cross the line without paying the price. Subscribe if you believe some battles deserve to be heard. Standard procedure, Lieutenant, said the sergeant in charge of cuffing her, his voice low, almost apologetic. I know, she replied. Her voice was calm, steady, as if reciting a line she'd known all her life. On the journalist's bench, a young woman with red hair took hurried notes. Beside her, a veteran of the military press shook his head. They're treating her like a threat, he said, as if she still had her rifle. That's what they want the public to think, the young woman replied. A threat, not a victim. Judge Franklin de Mercer then entered, heavy in his black robe, his face marked by a career spent observing war through the lens of the law. He tapped his desk flat with his hand, calling for silence. Lieutenant Emily Hayes, you are charged with assaulting a superior officer. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. And you understand the gravity of the accusation? Perfectly. The prosecutor rose slowly, his red tie like an open wound. Your Honor, allow me to remind the court that Lieutenant Hayes is a trained sniper, officially 34.5 confirmed neutralizations. Her training makes her dangerous. For her safety and ours, the handcuffs are justified. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, dangerous. The words spread like wildfire. Emily felt her heart beat faster, but her face remained still. In her mind, one sentence repeated itself, they're not afraid of me. They're afraid of what I represent. The judge looked up at her. You served in 3 war zones. You were decorated for bravery. Why are you here today? Emily met his gaze. Because one day, I refused an order that had nothing to do with combat. A silence. Then the prosecutor let out a dry laugh. A refusal of an order? Oh, you mean an order from a superior officer? She did not answer. The judge sighed, visibly irritated by the spectacle. Let's get to the point. The evidence, counselor. The prosecutor leaned over his file. Testimony from Captain Michael Tran, the accused direct superior. Signs of a struggle. An indirect witness. And a record of chronic insubordination. The word insubordination brought a faint smile to Emily's lips. If courage had another name, that would be it. Behind her, a senior officer murmured, they want to break her. Another replied, no, they just want her to shut up. Judge Mercer began to speak, but the sudden crash of the courtroom doors cut him off. Boom! Everyone turned. The soldiers in the room rose as one. The nervous clerk nearly shouted, an admiral in the room. The chatter stopped instantly. Even the flashes went silent. In the doorway stood an immense figure, draped in a spotless white uniform. The golden epaulets gleamed under the lights. The air itself seemed to freeze, as if the room were holding its breath. Admiral Robert St. Clair stepped forward with measured steps, eyes fixed straight ahead, silent. His gaze swept over the judge, the prosecutor, and finally landed on Emily. She didn't move, though her hands trembled ever so slightly. He stopped 1 meter from her. The silence was absolute. St. Clair drew a small silver key from his pocket and, without asking permission, released the lock of the handcuffs. Clack! The metal hit the floor with a heavy thud, echoing through the room like a cannon shot. No one dared move. The judge raised his hand, hesitant. Admiral, I. St. Clair didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Emily, and his voice carried no anger, no pity, only a cold certainty. No one chains a soldier who has shed blood for this country. Not today. Not in my presence. The entire room held its breath. The cold metal cuffs still lay on the floor when Admiral St. Clair straightened slowly. No one dared to move. Judge Mercer wet his lips, throat dry, aware that every gesture from now on would be scrutinized by the cameras. Admiral St. Clair. I'm not sure I understand your intervention. That's all right, the Admiral replied without looking at him. You will, soon enough. His voice carried no military authority. It was the voice of a man used to speaking to the wind, to the ocean, to death, calm, but impossible to contradict. He turned toward Emily. Lieutenant Hayes. She straightened instinctively, a soldier's reflex. Admiral. Are you hurt? Only my pride, sir. A faint smile crossed her face, almost imperceptible. Then, aloud so every word echoed to the walls. Her hands, he said, pointing to Emily's, have done more for this country than all the statements of this court combined. Her hands have held a sniper's breath steady at 2 kilometers from her target under enemy fire. And you dare to chain them? Silence followed. Prosecutor Blem tried to regain his composure. Admiral, with all due respect, this is a military hearing. And your presence was not planned? St. Clair finished for him. Exactly. What you're doing here wasn't planned either. He stepped forward 2 paces. The air seemed to vibrate around him. It wasn't anger, it was the weight of legitimacy. Emily felt her muscles loosen, her heartbeat in her temples. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not judged, but recognized. Judge Mercer searched for his words. Admiral St. Clair, this court acts in accordance with military code. The charges are serious. The charges are false, St. Clair cut in, his tone icy. And if you want to speak of code, let's start with the code of honor. A murmur rose from the audience. Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. The prosecutor signaled a clerk to cut the cameras, but St. Clair stopped him with a single gesture. Keep them rolling. The country should see how you treat its soldiers. Emily closed her eyes briefly. The Admiral's words struck her like slow bullets. In her memory, another sound surfaced, the wind in the desert, the click of the rifle, the steady breath before the shot. A memory overwhelmed her. Fallujah, 2016. The sand whipped her face. She remembered the heat, the taste of blood on her lips. Her teen was cornered in an alley, civilians trapped between the lines. A voice in her earpiece. No fire without order. Ace, repeat, no fire without order. But through her scope, she saw a little girl running, a grenade in the hands of a terrified boy. 1 second. She inhaled, aimed, fired. Red dust. Silence. She had saved 6 lives that day, and ever since, they had told her she acted out of emotion. Back in the courtroom, the judge's voice pulled her back to the present. Lieutenant Hayes, can you confirm that you were ordered not to engage? Yes, sir. And why did you disobey? Emily looked him straight in the eyes. Because it was unjust. St. Clair turned his head slowly toward Mercer. That's why she's here. Because she refused to stay silent in the face of injustice, and because she disobeyed a man who confuses authority with power. Captain Tran's name had not yet been spoken, but it hung in the air like a shadow. The prosecutor slammed his file shut. Admiral, that has nothing to do with this case. The incident you're referring to is unrelated to the current assault. Oh, it's all connected, said St. Clair, lowering his voice. You'll soon understand why. Then, turning to the judge, I request that the lieutenant be released into my custody until the hearing resumes. You have my signature and my word. Mercer hesitated, then nodded. Granted. A sigh of relief rippled through the room. Emily felt invisible chains loosen inside her. The Admiral briefly placed his hand on her shoulder. Hold fast, Lieutenant. The storm is only beginning. They left the courtroom together under the frozen stares of the journalists. Outside, the sun beat down on the steps like white fire. Where are we going? Asked Emily. To where it all began, he replied. To where they decided your silence was worth more than your life. He climbed into the official car. She sat beside him. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse slowly faded, swallowed by the dust. And in that dust, Emily felt the desert return, the sand of Fallujah, and the lie that had followed her ever since that day. The wind blew like a dry cry through the ruins. The sand carried the smell of burnt metal, kerosene, and blood. Emily Hayes adjusted the scope of her M200, lying on the roof of a shattered school. Beneath her, Fallujah trembled with heat and fear. Bravo team, position confirmed. Sergeant Doyer's voice crackled in her earpiece. This is Hayes. High position, North Sector. Visual on main market. Stay on observation. No fire without order. The same words, always the same. No fire without order. She had heard them in 3 war zones, 3 too many. To her right, Private Jenkins watched the alleys through his rifle scope. He was sweating, nervous. "I think he's moving," he muttered. "You see the kid with the bag?" Emily shifted her scope. A boy, barely 12, was walking forward, eyes empty. Behind him, 2 armed figures were already retreating. The bag on his back was too heavy, too stiff. "That's not a kid," she said. "That's a walking bomb." In her earpiece, Doyer's voice came through again. "Wait for command confirmation, Lieutenant. We don't have time." She breathed slowly. The seconds stretched like years. Through the scope, she saw the boy stumble, look up. Their eyes met. A tear, or maybe just a drop of sweat, ran down his cheek. "Don't shoot, Ace." Too late. Bang. The silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It was the sound of conscience. The blast shockwave shook the street. The bag had detonated earlier than expected, thrown off by her shot. Without her, the entire market would have vanished. She had saved 6 civilians, 2 Marines, and 1 journalist. But on the radio, the silence from command weighed heavy. "Command to Bravo Unit. Ace remains in position. Report immediately upon return to base." Night fell. The sand had turned to ash. Emily sat in the back of the armored vehicle, helmet on her knees. Doyer placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved their lives, Ace. You think they'll see it that way?" He shrugged. "You know how they are. If it wasn't ordered, it didn't happen." When they returned to base, the reception was cold, air conditioning, averted gazes, corridors too clean. Captain Michael Tran stood waiting, hands clasped behind his back. "Lieutenant Hayes, you disobeyed a direct order." "I prevented an attack, sir." "That's not the point. You fired without authorization." She bit her tongue to keep from answering. "My report, sir?" "You'll write it. But keep this in mind, courage doesn't replace discipline." She left, jaw tight. Jenkins caught up to her in the hallway. "He's chewing you out because you did what he never dared to do." The following days were a blur of reports, interrogations, and hostile looks. Some comrades congratulated her in secret, others avoided her. At night, she cleaned her rifle in the silence of her tent. Every polished piece reflected her own doubt. Acted out of emotion, the officers had written in her file. 3 words were enough to erase everything she had done. One night, while the camp slept, she climbed to the roof of the observation bunker. The desert sky burned with white stars. Doyer joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. "You never sleep, do you?" "Not since that day." "Would you do it again?" She thought for a moment. "Yes. Even knowing what it would cost me." He nodded slowly. "Then you have nothing to regret." The next day, Captain Tran summoned her to his office. The room smelled of leather and dust from old files. He looked at her with a cold smile. "You're exceptional, Lieutenant, and you know it. But around here, that kind of attitude attracts the wrong kind of attention." "I already have some, sir." "There's a line you don't cross, Ace. The Army loves heroes, as long as they stay in their place." She held his gaze. "And what's mine, Captain?" "The one you're given." He slid a file toward her, her disciplinary report. Insubordination. Breach of protocol. Unstable emotional state. Every word was a slow poison. Before leaving, she turned back. "You can write whatever you want. What happened out there, I'd do it again. Because if that's what it means to be a soldier, then I am one." A few months later, she received a citation for bravery. The newspapers told the story of an American sniper's heroic shot. But at the base, the silence remained the same, forced smiles, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, and behind every congratulation, she felt Captain Tran's gaze like a shadow waiting for its moment. In her tent, alone, she opened a letter she had never sent. "Dear Command. You taught me to shoot without hesitation, but never to stay silent in the face of injustice. If that makes me a bad soldier, then I am one, with honor." She folded the letter and slipped it into her notebook. She knew that day in Fallujah she hadn't just fired at an enemy, she had started a bigger war, a war against the system. Her return to the United States was colder than she'd imagined. No fanfare, no cameras, only rain beating against the Norfolk tarmac, and an anonymous officer shaking her hand without meeting her eyes. "Welcome home, Lieutenant." Home? Emily felt the word ring hollow. The naval base felt foreign, too quiet after the chaos of Fallujah. The gray walls, the spotless flags, the corridors where rumors slid faster than the wind. The next day, she was summoned to an informal meeting with her superior, Captain Michael Tran, the same man whose voice still reminded her of the arrogance of the desert. He was waiting in his office, leaning against the window with a faint smile. Lieutenant Hayes, still standing tall. "They say war leaves marks, but you seem untouched." "I've learned to hide them, sir." He gestured for her to sit. On his desk lay a thick folder with her name on it. "You know why I called you in? To talk about my report, among other things." He snapped the folder shut. "You did good work, but let's just say some people in command aren't entirely comfortable with your way of doing things." Emily frowned. "Saving lives makes them uncomfortable?" "That's not what I said." He smiled. "You fired without an order, and you proved that a woman could disobey a man in a critical situation. Messages like that tend to bother people." She felt a burn rise in her throat. "With all due respect, sir, that message is the truth." Tran stepped closer, slowly. "You're brilliant, Lieutenant. But the military world isn't ready for your truth. You want my advice? Stay quiet. Don't make waves." She stood up, fists clenched. "I didn't come here to stay quiet, Captain." The weeks that followed were a slow suffocation. Every day, a small incident, a missing report, a meeting she wasn't told about, whispered remarks in the cafeteria. The sentimental sniper. The one who shoots when she feels like it. A woman, what else? The looks weighed heavier than the words. Even her comrade Jenkins seemed to drift away little by little. One night, coming back from the training room, she found a photo taped to her locker, a picture of her taken during an exercise. Someone had scrawled on it, "Good trigger, bad soldier." She stood frozen for a long time, the photo between her fingers, then tore it up slowly, piece by piece. A few days later, Captain Tran organized a dinner to strengthen team cohesion. Everyone was invited. Emily hesitated, but refusing would only feed the rumors. The restaurant was loud, thick with the smell of whiskey and sea oil. Laughter burst out, toasts followed one after another. Tran, impeccable in his uniform, presided over the table, playing the part of the benevolent mentor. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, raising his glass, "to our snipers, the most precise, and the most beautiful weapons in the country." Crude laughter erupted around the table. Emily froze. "I'd prefer we talk about precision, not seduction, sir." "Oh, don't be so serious," he replied with a wink. "A woman can be beautiful and dangerous, can't she?" The others fell silent, uncomfortable. She stood abruptly. "Excuse me." In the hallway, she took a deep breath. Anger and shame tangled in her throat. Behind her, footsteps. "Emily, wait." "Tran." She turned. "I think the evening's over for me." "That's no reason to disrespect your superiors." He stepped closer, too close. The smell of alcohol on his breath, his tone falsely gentle. "You know, some officers would love to see you fail. But me, I can protect you, if you know how to show a little gratitude." Her blood went cold. "Step back, Captain. This isn't a threat, it's an opportunity." He placed a hand on her arm. She shoved it away sharply. "Don't touch me." Silence fell heavy. His expression shifted, from charming to cold, almost cruel. "Very well, Lieutenant. You just refused the only lifeline you had left." She walked away without looking back, but behind her she could already feel the weight of vengeance coming. The following days, the reprisals began. A surprise inspection of her quarters, irregularities. A falsified report about a training mission. A transfer request denied without explanation. Jenkins tried to warn her. "He's breaking you down, Ace. Doing it clean, slow." "Then I'll endure," she said. But at night, alone in her room, she felt the walls closing in. The silence of others devoured her more surely than the attacks. And in that silence, she still heard Tran's voice, "I can protect you." She understood then that in this army, the real danger wasn't on the battlefield. It wore golden stripes and a perfect smile, and one day, sooner or later, it would force her to strike back. The rain had begun to fall, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the day's scars. But the water slid down the steel of the hangars without erasing a thing. Thunder rumbled in the distance like a distant threat. Emily was coming back late, her shoulders heavy from the day, training, paperwork, sidelong glances. She entered the officer's building thinking about a report she had to submit, not about a trap. Captain Tran was waiting in the shadow of a corridor, his silhouette sharp against the cold light of a lamp. When he saw her, a smile spread across his face, one that held nothing friendly. "Lieutenant Ace," he said softly. "We need to talk about your attitude. Right now." She set down her bag, feeling the air freeze in her chest. "I've already scheduled a formal meeting, Captain. If this concerns feedback, we can do it in the presence." "In the presence of who?" he interrupted. "Those who whisper because they're afraid. No. Here, between you and me, that's what we call honesty." The words dripped with menace beneath their polished surface. Emily caught the artificial scent of his cologne and the sudden flash of memory, his hand on her arm at the dinner. Her stomach tightened. "I have nothing to say," she replied. "Don't play the heroine, Ace," he said, stepping closer. "You know very well I can make your career easier. You know what I can do, and you know what I expect." He reached out slowly, as if to take hold of something fragile. Emily stepped back. The walls seemed to close in. "Let me go, Captain." He laughed softly, a sound without warmth. "You can't leave. Not until I've gotten what I want." Tran's hand came down on her shoulder, then slid, trying to pull her closer. Emily felt rage rise inside her like a metallic taste in her mouth. All her training, the discipline drilled into her over years of missions, turned into a cold fury. "Don't touch me," she said again. "Don't come near me." He tightened his grip. His voice, once honeyed, turned into a threat. "Understand this, Ace. Men like me get what they ask for." Something inside her snapped, not an explosion, but a clean, surgical decision, as precise as one of her shots. She couldn't allow this man to turn his authority into violence. She brought her palm under his hand and shoved it sharply away. Tran staggered, more surprised than hurt, and tried to regain control with the same arrogant composure. He grabbed her wrist to pull her back toward him. Emily, driven by pure reflex, twisted free and pivoted. Their bodies brushed for an instant. Her boot struck the floor, his balance gave way. Tran stumbled, tripped against a bench, and slammed into the wall. The dull thud echoed like a gunshot through the empty corridor. He fell. His head struck the concrete hard. The silence that followed was full and heavy. Raindrops slid down the window, indifferent. Emily stood frozen, breathing fast, staring at the man lying still. Her heart pounded, not with triumph, but with dread. The knowledge that this moment, even in self-defense, could turn against her. Footsteps came before she could move. Two soldiers, alerted by the noise, rushed in, flashlights raised, eyes wide. A voice down the hall shouted, "We need a medic." Within minutes, the corridor filled with grim faces, a superior officer barking orders, a nurse checking Tran's pulse. Emily felt someone grab her arm roughly. Words rained down around her. "Stay calm. Stay right here. Don't move." She felt the cold bite of handcuffs close around her wrists a few hours later, once the decision to arrest her had been made. "He attacked me," she said hoarsely to anyone who would listen. They listen at first the way people listen to a story they're not sure they believe. Then the administrative machine began to move. Incident report, isolation, interrogation. Tran groaned on his hospital bed. The doctors spoke of a concussion, of tests to be done. The witnesses gave blurred versions, clouded by fear of taking sides. She was led to a small, windowless isolation cell. Her bag lay against the metal bench, mirroring her shape. Her mouth was dry, her head full of images, the heat of the desert, the curve of a rifle's bolt, the face of a fallen comrade. Tran's voice, "I can protect you," now twisted into a threat. She thought of her childhood friend who had once told her, "Never let anyone buy your silence." She had carried those words like an invisible medal. In the hours that followed, command began to build a case. The official words were clear, cold, and merciless: assault on a superior officer, breach of discipline, unpredictable behavior. They spoke of the need for an impartial investigation, but the air buzzed with something else, the unspoken assumption that a woman who defends herself is dangerous, uncontrollable. The comrades who had once respected Emily found themselves trapped between what they had seen, a man attacking a woman, and their loyalty to the system that covered it all up. Some, uneasy, refused to testify. Others turned away in silence. Jenkins walked past her cell and looked the other way. Doyer gave her a pained look but couldn't bring himself to enter. That night, locked away, Emily saw another image burn into her mind, the coffin of Andres R. Morales, her brother-in-arms, killed 2 years earlier in an ambush. He had taught her to treat fear as a tool, not an enemy. She had sworn, in front of his photo, never to let fear silence her. And now, facing the accusations to come, she knew that keeping that promise would cost her more than anything she had ever paid before. The investigators arrived the next morning, solemn. The questions began. Why did you react that way? Did you have a history of aggression? What exactly did you see? Every question was a discreet blade. Emily answered with the same precision she used in combat. She laid out the facts, Tran's behavior, her own actions. The more she spoke, the more she felt the room fill with a cold mixture of calculation and hostility. Outside, in the corridors, the whispers took on a new form. They looked at her as one looks at a bomb that hasn't yet gone off. Strong women become dangerous when they stop being controlled, someone whispered, not realizing she could hear. The case was closing in on her. Command recommended temporary suspension, isolation pending investigation. The army that had trained her and covered her in medals was now beginning the process of turning a hero into an example, not for honor, but for warning. Emily lay back on the cold bench, staring at the small high window that offered a thin rectangle of sky. Above, the clouds were breaking apart, letting through a pale ray of light. She thought of Fallujah, of the shot, of Morales, of Admiral St. Clair, whose role she did not yet know. She thought of all the women who had endured humiliation and threats for refusing to bow. And she told herself, without a shadow of doubt, that she would not yield. Let them paint her as guilty, mad, dangerous, she would endure, because the truth, she now knew, might be slow to prevail, but she was ready to defend it, even if it meant losing everything she had left. The day of the trial opened under a low sky, heavy as a threat. Emily Hayes was brought from her cell in a military jeep escorted by 2 silent guards. Through the window, the base stretched out, familiar and foreign at once. The same gray buildings she had once seen as refuge now seemed made of stone and judgment. In the tribunal corridor, her boots echoed on the floor like the sound of arms being drawn. Everyone stared, officers, journalists, former comrades, but no gaze lasted more than a second. She walked with her head high, repeating to herself, show nothing. Not yet. Inside, Captain Michael Tran sat in a wheelchair, his head bandaged. His performance was perfect. The prosecutor spoke first, listing the charges in a dry voice. The army must set an example. If indiscipline and violence take root within its own ranks, where will we end up? Emily watched him silently. In her pressed blue uniform, she seemed both cornered and unbreakable. She thought of Fallujah, of the desert heat, of the shot she had never regretted. And she understood that this day, it wasn't only she who was being judged, it was what her presence there represented, living proof that a woman could be formidable without permission. Judge Mercier motioned to Admiral St. Clair, seated at the back, to step forward. The room froze. Everyone knew he hadn't been officially summoned, but no one dared stop him. St. Clair advanced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze made of steel. Your Honor, he said in a deep voice, I request the right to testify on behalf of Lieutenant Ace. The prosecutor tried to object. Admiral, that's not part of the procedure. Nothing that's just ever is, he cut in. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Granted. Proceed, Admiral. St. Clair placed a thick beige folder on the table. These are classified reports, declassified this morning by the Naval Bureau. They concern internal complaints filed against Captain Tran over the last 4 years. The murmur that rose in the room tasted of shock. 3 female testimonies, the Admiral continued. Accusations of abuse of authority, harassment, intimidation. All dismissed. The files disappeared from internal archives, until this morning. The prosecutor blanched. This is a breach of procedure. No, St. Clair corrected. This is the exposure of a corrupted one. He stepped closer, barely inclining his head. You remember Ensign Carver, don't you? The one who requested a transfer before being sent to a high-risk zone. She never came back. Tran turned his eyes away. St. Clair went on. And today, you dare speak of discipline. What you call indiscipline, I call the courage to refuse submission. Silence thickened. Emily stared at St. Clair, unable to speak. He had revealed those files without warning her, risking his own career. The judge was already leafing through the documents, his face grave. Are these materials authentic? Absolutely, St. Clair replied. And there's more. He took out an audio recording. A recognizable voice filled the room, Tran's, caught unknowingly in a corridor. She thinks someone will defend her. I'll teach her how far a soldier's loyalty really goes. The blood drained from the prosecutor's face. The judge raised his hand, stopping the recording. The silence that followed was almost painful. St. Clair straightened and looked around the entire room. Lieutenant Ace has fired to save lives. She defended herself when an officer tried to silence her. That's the truth. And if you condemn this woman today, then you condemn everything that remains of military honor. Judge Mercer ran a weary hand over his face. His eyes turned toward Emily. Lieutenant, would you like to say something before the court deliberates? She rose slowly. Her voice was low, but each word fell like a precise bullet. I didn't choose this war, neither the one in the desert, nor this one. But when a man believes he can own what he commands, when obedience becomes more important than justice, then the war is already lost. A tear slid down the cheek of a young officer in the audience. No one applauded, but the entire room vibrated with silent respect. The judge withdrew. A few minutes later, he returned, pale, exhausted, but clear. The military court declares Lieutenant Emily Hayes not guilty of all charges. Captain Michael Tran is suspended from duty pending disciplinary investigation. A breath swept through the room. Invisible chains broke. Emily felt her knees tremble but held firm. Admiral St. Clair approached her quietly. You're free, Lieutenant. At what cost? She murmured. The right one, the cost of truth. Then, low enough for her alone to hear, he added, they told me it would take a man to break the silence. They were wrong. He saluted the judge and left the room without another word. When the door closed behind him, Emily stood still for a moment, her eyes lost in the void. She could still hear the distant applause of civilians outside. Journalists were shouting her name, but inside her, there was only silence, not the silence of fear, but the rarer one, of justice finally heard. The morning after the verdict, the military base felt different. The wind that rippled the flag carried another sound, that of a muffled liberation. Yet Emily Ace walked like a shadow between the gray buildings. Every salute she received rang hollow, uncertain, a mix of forced respect and fear of being associated with her. The morning papers carried the headline, Lieutenant Ace cleared, Tran scandal erupts. Beneath the photo of Emily in handcuffs, the words danced like a long-delayed revenge. But in the cafeteria, no one dared sit at her table. Conversation stopped when she passed. The army, as always, had found a way to punish even innocents, with silence. In the command office, Judge Mercer was signing disciplinary orders. Captain Tran left the hospital this morning, an aide announced. He's requested early retirement, and the prosecutor has resigned under pressure from the press and the Senate. Mercer nodded. Part of him felt relieved, another part ashamed. He thought of St. Clair's words, what you call indiscipline is the courage to refuse submission. He looked toward the window where the American flag was reflected and murmured, maybe it took a woman to remind us what honor means. That day, Emily was summoned to a room where a journalist awaited, the same young red-haired woman she had noticed on the first day of the trial. Lieutenant Ace, she said, I'm Claire Duval, the Atlantic Post. May I ask you a few questions? Emily hesitated, then nodded. You've been cleared, Claire said, but you seem more sad than relieved. Why? Because I won alone, Emily answered. And in that victory, I lost a lot. The journalist took notes silently. Emily continued, what I lived through isn't an exception. It's a system that prefers silence to truth. I was lucky an Admiral walked into that room at the right moment. Others had no one. What do you plan to do now? Claire asked. I don't know. Maybe leave. Maybe speak. She paused, then added, I don't want to be a heroine, just proof that lies can fall, even when they wear a uniform. In the following days, revelations continued. 3 other women, inspired by the trial, filed complaints against Tran and 2 officers in his circle. Emails surfaced, compromising exchanges, falsified internal memos. Newspapers spoke of a moral cleansing in the Navy. But for Emily, it was a victory without shine. She spent her evenings walking along the docks. The salty wind, the cries of the gulls, the steady rhythm of the waves, they soothed her. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hangars, she heard a voice behind her. "You're still here, Lieutenant?" She turned. Admiral St. Clair. He wore a simple gray coat. "I thought you'd left the base," she said. "I wanted to thank you." They walked side by side along the pier. "You did what many would never have dared," he said. "You held on." "I did," she replied. "But what's the point if the system stays the same?" "You don't see it yet," he said. "But you crack something. And when a wall cracks, sooner or later, it falls." She looked at him doubtfully. "And you risked your career for me." "Why?" St. Clair half smiled. "Because I've known men like Tran all my life, and I've lost too many good soldiers because of them. You reminded me of what I'd forgotten. Loyalty isn't earned by rank, but by truth." They remained silent for a while. The lights of the harbor trembled on the water. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe go back to shooting. Maybe write." "Right," he said softly. "Bullets kill, but words change laws." A faint laugh escaped her. "Funny to hear that from an admiral." "Even the sea calms eventually," he replied. "And sometimes storms bring flowers." A few days later, a letter arrived in her name, on official letterhead. "The command informs you that Captain Tran's case has been transferred to the federal tribunal. Your statements have served as the basis for an internal reform of the military code of conduct on assaults and abuse of power." She stared for a long time at the signature at the bottom of the page. She thought of all those who had never had a St. Clair to defend them. This time, she smiled, not out of triumph, but peace. That same evening, she placed her medals in a box. On the back of the last one was engraved, "To the one who refused to be silent." She closed the lid gently, as one closes a chapter. Outside, the wind still blew, but it no longer carried fear. It carried the promise of a world a little more just. 3 months had passed. Winter had covered the base with a pale veil, and the sea, usually roaring, seemed to have quieted. The days had grown longer, but for Emily Ace, time had stopped somewhere between relief and emptiness. That morning, she stood before a mirror, adjusting her new uniform. The decorations gleamed under the artificial light. Impeccable. In a few minutes, she would enter the great command hall to receive a medal she had never wanted. A voice came from behind the door. "Lieutenant Ace, the ceremony is about to begin." "I'm coming." She took a deep breath. Her boots were polished, her collar straight, everything seemed in order except her eyes, where fatigue and distance mingled. She hadn't set foot on a firing range in weeks. Her nights were filled with confused images, the handcuffs, Tran's face, St. Clair's hand releasing the medal, the noise of the crowd. The Hall of Honor was packed, officers, journalists, senators. Admiral St. Clair sat in the front row, straight as a mast. When she entered, everyone rose. A military fanfare echoed, solemn and hollow. General North took the podium. "Today we honor courage, not only the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to say no when everything pushes you to stay silent. Lieutenant Emily Hayes has defended not only the integrity of the uniform, but also that of the truth." Applause burst out. Emily climbed the stage. The general pinned a gold medal suspended from a navy blue ribbon to her chest. "You've reminded the army what it means to serve," he said. She nodded, smiled out of formality. The camera flashes struck her face. They always love heroes, she thought, especially when the heroes stay quiet. After the ceremony, she stepped out onto the terrace. The cold February wind whipped her face. Behind her, the speeches continued. Before her, the sea stretched out, vast, indifferent. "You could have refused the medal," said a deep voice. She turned. "St. Clair." "I considered it," she replied, "but then they would have made it another story, the ungrateful soldier." "You're right," he said. "Sometimes you have to accept victory, even when it tastes bitter." They stood side by side in silence for a moment. "You know," he added, "the Senate passed the reform you inspired. Internal procedures can no longer bury complaints. So, it wasn't for nothing. Nothing is ever for nothing, she said. Even pain ends up serving someone. He handed her an envelope. Transfer order. You're reinstated in the Special Forces, if you wish. She took it without opening it. And if I refuse? Then you're free. Truly free. A faint smile passed between them. Thank you, Admiral, for everything. Don't thank me. You reminded me why I wear this uniform. He saluted, then walked away, his white silhouette fading into the harbor mist. That evening, alone in her room, Emily placed the medal on the table. The lamplight danced across the metal. She slowly opened St. Clair's envelope. Inside, beneath the signature, was a handwritten line, "Battles change, but true soldiers never disappear." She closed the letter and put it away carefully. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, silent and soft. She thought of Fallujah, of the little girl she had saved, and of all those she'd never been able to save, from another kind of war, the one that left no visible scars. Her eyes fell on the medal. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, then exhaled. Courage isn't facing death, she whispered. It's finding a way to live after. She placed the medal in the box where her old decorations already lay, then closed the lid. The sharp sound of metal against wood rang out like an ending. Or perhaps a beginning. She turned off the light, leaving the room in a soft half-darkness. Outside, the calm sea breathed slowly. The night spread over the base like a velvet shroud. Emily Ace crossed the training field alone, her hands in the pockets of her jacket. The sky was clear, scattered with cold stars. She stopped in front of the old shooting hangar, abandoned for months. A flickering bulb lit the metal door. She went in. The familiar smell of gunpowder and gun oil enveloped her. On the wall, the worn targets still bore the marks of old shots, most of them hers. She switched on the neon lights, set her bag on the table, and took out her rifle. The cold metal against her palm awakened a deep memory, precision, focus, the balance between strength and calm. She slowly loaded a single bullet. Not to kill, to remember. The shot rang out, clean, perfect. The center of the target shattered in silence. She set the rifle down, sighed, and half-smiled. It was no longer a weapon, but an echo of everything she had been. Then she sat on the shooting bench and took from her bag a wooden box, the same one where her medals slept. She opened it. The light reflected off the metal, off the colored ribbons, off the new decorations she had received a few days earlier. She gazed at them for a long time. Each medal told a story, not the kind taught in manuals, but the kind fought when no one is watching. Holding on when everything collapses, saying no when everything pushes you to obey, standing tall even when truth comes at a high cost. She took the last one, the one with the navy blue ribbon, held it tightly in her hand, then slowly placed it at the bottom of the box. True courage, she murmured, is no longer needing anyone to tell you that you've had it. She closed the box, slipped it into her bag, and stood up. As she left the hangar, she saw light glimmering in the distance, a thread of gold above the sea. The first waves were breaking gently against the jetty. The cool wind whipped her face. She stopped on the pier, facing the water, and let silence wash over her. Everything she had been through, the fear, the shame, the anger, the judgment, was slowly fading. All that remained was peace. Admiral St. Clair had been right, some wars are won without firing a shot. She thought of other women, the ones she had never met, but who might now be reading her name in the papers. Perhaps somewhere, a young recruit hesitated a little less to speak, to defend herself, to stand up, and that was enough. She took a deep breath and looked toward the horizon. The sun was breaking through slowly, making the surface of the water shimmer. Her reflection, distorted by the waves, gave her back a calm smile. Later, she left the base without ceremony. No fanfare, no speeches, just a bag, a train ticket, and the feeling of having closed a circle. In the train carriage, she watched the landscape passing by, her head resting against the window. Freedom had a strange taste, neither victory nor defeat, just the right to exist without permission. On her knees lay a notebook. She wrote a few words inside. There are wars that can only be won by staying standing, not by shooting. Courage is getting back up when no one is watching anymore. And sometimes, heroes no longer wear uniforms. She closed the notebook and slipped it back into her bag. A soft, sincere smile came to her lips. The train sped toward the unknown. Outside, the fields stretched out, bathed in light. When she left the station, she cast one last glance toward the sky. The breeze still carried a hint of the ocean. She thought of St. Clair, of Jenkins, of all those who had crossed her path, and of those she would never see again. But she had no regrets now, only one certainty: she had survived everything without ever betraying herself. She walked toward the city, anonymous among the passers-by, light-hearted. The world around her murmured, full of stories yet to come. And without looking back, she whispered, "If you still believe that strength has no gender, share this story."